Right, so in our previous lecture, we looked at the defense of justification, which was the defense of self-defense and necessity. So today, well, right now, we'll be moving on to excuses under English law. So as mentioned, we'll be dealing with duress, intoxication, and insanity. And in this lecture, we'll be dealing with the first, which is the defense of duress. Now, duress is very interesting. Right here is a scenario from TV series 24, where there was a terrorist who was threatening to release a poisonous gas, killing thousands of people, and basically told the U.S. government that they will do that unless they kill an FBI agent, right? Unless they kill an FBI agent. So they had to call the hero of the series, Jack Bauer, and Jack Bauer was instructed by the president to carry out this execution, right? In order to prevent the terrorists from releasing the poisonous gas. And that's what Jack Bauer did, right? He actually killed the FBI agent in order to prevent the terrorists from actually releasing the poisonous gas. So now the question is that Jack Bauer, the character who killed the FBI agent, can he be charged for murder? And can he say that he was acting under duress? Right, he was acting under duress. If he didn't kill this person, if he didn't kill this agent, then thousands of other people would die. Right. So that is basically what duress is all about. Right. Duress is when a person is forced to commit a crime, right? He's forced to commit a crime that he doesn't want to do it, but he will in the end still do it in order to avoid greater harm, so to say, right? The person is said to be acting under duress if he is forced to do something that he doesn't want to do. And the rationale behind the defense of duress is that the law cannot expect ordinary people to show extraordinary courage in resisting such fearsome threats. Right. So the key thing about duress is that there is threats. There's threats made that if he doesn't commit an offense, then he will suffer the consequences. Okay. So nobody can expect, we can expect everybody to show extraordinary courage. Not everybody are like superheroes who are willing to sacrifice themselves. And this is a concession to human frailty, right? Concession to human frailty. Not everybody is perfect. Not everybody can be strong enough to say that I will not commit a crime, no matter what you say or do to me. And I agree with this third one the most is that these people who commit crimes under duress did not have a fair opportunity to comply with the law. Right? They did not have a fair chance to comply with the law. For us, we can choose very well not to commit an offense because we are not threatened in any way. But for these people, they are threatened, right? They're threatened with some bad things, and therefore, right, if they do not commit the crimes, then they will suffer the consequences. So it's not fair to them. However, on the other side, right, on the other side of the argument, there's the view that duress should not be allowed because allowing duress causes the law to lose some of its deterrent effect. Right, it can lose some of its deterrent effect, and I like the second one also. Allowing the defendant to plead duress for the most serious crimes gives protection to cowards and removes it from the innocent victims. So there are two arguments, right? There are always arguments for and against for in almost everything. So for duress also, there are those who say that it should be allowed. There are those who say it shouldn't be allowed. But under English law, it is allowed. Okay, it is allowed, but subject to certain to limitations. So we will see that now. Okay, so when we talk about duress, we'll first look at the type of threat. What is the type of threat that will be sufficient for a person to successfully raise the defense of duress? Surely not all kinds of threat, right? And also the test for duress. Okay, and spoiler alert, you will see that duress is not allowed for situations where the defendant voluntarily associates himself with criminal organizations, and neither is it allowed for the offense of murder. But first, let's look at the type of threat. Now, case law has provided that duress is only allowed if the threat is of death or serious injury, right? Death or serious injury. And this is provided for in the case of DPP and Lynch. Okay, DPP and Lynch, the court made it very clear that only threats of death or serious injury would suffice for the court to consider whether duress is applicable or not. So all other kinds of threats, right? If it's minor injury, uh, threats of, like, for example, if I tell you that if you don't do this crime, I'm going to fail you in your exams. Okay, that's not good enough. Although some of you say that failing exams is probably a fate worse than death, but it's not death, it's not serious injury. So therefore, it cannot be you cannot raise a defense of duress. So it must only be death or serious injury. Now take note that DPP and Lynch is good law for this. However, DPP and Lynch was actually a case where duress was allowed in the case of murder. Now that was in 1975 and it was still allowed, but now it's no longer allowed for murder, which we will see later. But DPP and Lynch is still good authority that the type of threat must be one of death or serious injury. Now, in the case of Valderrama Vega, right, the threat was of serious injury. However, it was also there were also other things included, like for example, they threatened to expose him as a homosexual, right? So it's probably to ruin his life because he's a married man, and also to maybe subject to shame and ridicule, right? Now, the trial judge actually said that duress can only be applicable if the threat was solely on death or serious injury. However, this part of the judgment was not accepted in the Court of Appeal, which basically said that as long as death or serious injury are the threats, right? They could also be other threats, but it doesn't have to be solely death or serious injury. But there must be death or serious injury. But there can also be other threats, right? Now, the threat need not be directed at the defendant. So a person can say that if you do not do this, I'm going to kill somebody else, right? That is sufficient. That is good enough for the defense of duress. So it doesn't have to be directed at the defendant. In the case of Crown against Wright, the threat was directed against the defendant's boyfriend, and it was held that that can amount to duress. Now, in Crown against Shaler, right? Crown against Shaler was an interesting case. This was a case which involved a person who used to work for the MI5, right? This is the MI5 emblem. MI5 is basically internal security agents, as opposed to MI6 is foreign agents. So James Bond is a foreign spy, right? He goes to other places, but MI5 protects the territory. So Regnum Defender is the defend the realm. So their role is to actually protect the UK from terrorist attacks. Okay, so this was an agent, a former MI5 agent who has retired, and he wants to release some secrets that he knows. And his excuse was that he wants to do that in order to protect certain people, right? Because those people's lives are endangered. Now, the court rejected his defense. However, the court did say that you can use the defense if the secret agent was under, or if somebody threatened the secret agent that they will kill somebody specific, right? They will kill somebody, then that agent can be said to use the defense of duress. Okay, it doesn't have to be directed at that agent himself. The court went so far to even say that it can be directed to people who are unknown to the agent. Like, for example, they said that if you don't do this, I'm going to kill this, I'm going to blow up a restaurant, I'm going to blow up Starbucks nearby, where the people in Starbucks will die. So the agent may not even know who is at the Starbucks, but he knows that people are going to die. So that itself is sufficient, right? That itself is sufficient for the defense of duress to, for the type of threat to amount to a defense of duress. Now, the threat must also be operating on the defendant's mind when he was committing the offense. That means that the reason why the defendant was committing the offense was because of the threat, right? The threat caused the defendant to commit the offense. It's not that there was a threat, but the defendant happily went to commit the offense or was already planning to commit the offense anyway. Now, this was illustrated in the case of Crown against Hudson and Taylor, where the defendants were witnesses in the case, and they were basically threatened, right? They were basically threatened to tell lies in the court, okay, or else they would suffer the consequences of a serious injury. Now, so this Hudson and Taylor, they actually went to court and they committed perjury. When they committed perjury, they lied as witnesses, and they said that we did so under duress. And it was actually established in the case that while they were giving the testimony in court, the person who threatened them was actually present in court at that time. So that goes to that supported the argument that the reason why they actually lied was because they saw the person there in the courtroom and they were afraid for them for their own safety, and therefore they committed the offense. So it must be operating on the defendant's mind when he or she committed the offense. And the type of threat must also, right, the threat must also include the offense that needs to be committed, right, must also include the offense that needs to be committed. And we can see this in the case of Crown against Cole, right? In Crown against Cole was a case where he owed money to some loan sharks, and these loan sharks threatened to beat him up, cause him serious injury if he doesn't pay back the money that he owes them. So Cole went to commit robbery in order to get money to pay the loan sharks, right? So he said that, look, the threat was one of serious injury. They threatened to beat me up if I don't pay them pay them back their money. But the court said that yes, they threatened to beat you up, but they didn't ask you to commit any offense. They just say pay back the money, right? So for duress to be successful, the person making the threats must also say that you must commit this offense, right? If you don't commit this offense, then you will suffer the consequences. In the case of lynch, right, the definition that the House of Lords used was duress is that to denote such fear produced by threats of death or grievous bodily harm if a certain act is not done as overbear the actor's wish not to perform the act and is effective at the time of the act in constraining him to perform it. So you see, in this definition itself, it summarizes everything that we have seen, right? First, the threat must be one of death or serious injury, right? Grievous bodily harm. And then you see that the threat must also say that if a certain act is not done, so they must have nominated the offense, right? The crime that is to be committed. And then it was at the time of the act constraining him to perform it, so it was operating in his mind when he performed it. So that's basically the summary for the type of threats, right? The threat must be the threat of death or serious injury. Sorry, it's not death of serious injury. It should be or. And then it's a typo there. The threat need not be directed at the defendant, but it must be operating at the defendant's mind when he committed the offense. And the threat must also include the offense that needs to be committed. So only that type of threat can suffice for the defense of duress. But then you got to see whether the test is satisfied or not, right? So first you got to see there must be the right type of threat, okay? And then after that, if there was a right type of threat, then we got to use the test to determine whether duress is applicable or not. And the test for duress is laid down in the case of Graham and approved by the House of Lords in Howe, where basically Graham was regarding 3 people who lived together: a man, his wife, and his gay partner. Yeah, right? Interesting uh, household, you will say. So the man, basically the gay partner told the man to kill his wife. If he doesn't do it, then he will cause serious injury to the man. So he went to kill his wife. And then he said that he basically acted under duress. So the case of Crown against Graham, they discussed this and laid down the test for duress. And the test of duress is also a subjective test and an objective test. So there must be a subjective element as well as an objective element, just like for self-defense also. And a subjective element is that did the defendant act because of his reasonable belief in the threat? Now you see that this subjective part is not purely subjective, right? Because his belief, it must be his belief, right? But it must be a reasonable belief. It must be a reasonable belief in the threat. Okay? So he must have believed it, but it must have been a reasonable belief. And the objective test would be that would the person of reasonable firmness have acted in the way that he did? Okay? So subjective part is that did he do it because of a reasonable belief in the threat or not? And then would a person of reasonable firmness have done as he did in the same situation? Right? Case of Hurst is another case which actually talked about this test for duress, and which actually applied this. And it's interesting to compare this with the test for self-defense. For self-defense, there doesn't need to be a reasonable belief of the circumstances as long as he honestly believe it to be. However, for duress, the belief in the threat must have been a reasonable belief. Okay, we're going to discuss in our tutorials why do you think that this, for duress, it must be a reasonable belief, whereas for self-defense, as long as he honestly believe it, the court will accept it. Okay, so that's the basically for duress, right? We have to first determine whether what is the threat, and then we got to see whether it satisfies the test for duress or not. It's laid down in Graham and approved in Howe. Okay, but duress does not apply when the person voluntarily associates himself with criminal organizations. Right? So if a person voluntarily joins a gang, a criminal gang, a criminal organization, he or she may not be able to plead duress. Right? We look at the case of Crown against Sharp, where it was held that, and I quote, where a person had voluntarily and with knowledge of its nature joined a criminal organization or gang which he knew might bring pressure on him to commit an offense and was an active member when he was put under such pressure, he's entitled to rely on duress as a defense. So if you join a gang and you know, right, that they're going to force you to commit crimes, and then they in fact forces you to commit crimes, well, you voluntarily join them, you knew the consequences, so you will not be allowed to rely on the defense of duress. So the test here in Crown against Sharp is that he must have known, okay, that it will actually bring pressure on him to commit the offense. And also he must have known the nature of the organization that he joins. So it's a very subjective test. Now you compare that with the case of Crown against Baker, which was decided in 1999. Here the court held that where a defendant has to be aware of the risk. Well, no, sorry. What a defendant has to be aware of is the risk that the group might try to coerce him into committing criminal offenses of the type for which he is being tried by the use of violence or threats of violence. Okay, so he has got to be aware of the risk. So when you look at both cases of Crown against Sharp and Crown against Baker and Ward, is an subjective test, is whether did they know that they were going to be forced to commit the crime or commit the type of crime that they have committed. However, the House of Lords changed that in 2005 in the case of Hassan. Now, the case of Hassan was a case which involves a transporter, right? He was a driver. He was a driver for a prostitution ring. Okay, he was a driver for a prostitution ring, and he claims that the person who's his boss, a lady, has a very violent boyfriend, right? Has a very violent boyfriend, and if he doesn't do what he's supposed to do, then the boyfriend would probably cause him serious injury. So there was one time when he drove a prostitute to one of the customers, and the customer didn't change his mind, didn't want the prostitute, so he went in and he actually took some money from the customer, right? And he was charged with burglary, and he tried to rely on the defense of duress. He said that if he went back without any money, then the pimp's boyfriend would cause him serious injury. So he was acting under duress. And this is what the House of Lords says. The defense of duress was excluded as a result of the accused's voluntary association with others. He foresaw or should have foreseen the risk of being subjected to any compulsion by threats of violence. So here it echoes what was seen earlier in Sharp and Baker also. If he can foresee the risk of being subjected to any compulsion by threats of violence, but here it also says that, or he should have foreseen. So even if he didn't foresee it, if it was something that he should have foreseen, then he also will not be allowed to rely on the defense of duress. Now, the other situation where duress is not applicable is for the offense of murder. Right? And it's not just murder, it's murder or attempted murder. So in the case of Crown against Howe, the House of Lords there overruled DPP and Lynch and basically said that it's not used as a defense to murder, right? They cannot feel that it is good enough to excuse a defendant who has actually killed another person who's committed murder. Now, the case of Crown against Gotts was regarding attempted murder. In this case, a boy tried to kill his mother, and he said that he did so because if he didn't do so, the father would kill him. Yeah, what a family it is, right? And he basically said that he was acting under duress, but the court didn't allow it, right? Didn't allow it because duress is not allowed for murder, and therefore should not be allowed for attempted murder also. So what do you think? Right? Should duress be allowed for as a defense for murder? The idea is that if somebody threatens to kill you and asks you to kill another person, you should rather be killed rather than kill another person. I think that's the idea. But you must bear in mind that the threat need not be directed at the defendant. Okay, so if a person, if somebody goes up to the defendant and tells him that you got to kill, or yeah, you got to kill another person, the victim. If you don't do so, then I will kill your whole family. Now, surely, then in that situation, don't you think that the person can be excused, or maybe at the very least have his charge reduced from murder to manslaughter? Now, the Law Commission report, this is a very old report actually on murder, manslaughter, infanticide. The Law Commission was of the view that duress should be allowed as a full defense to murder, to attempted murder and manslaughter. I mean, at the end of the day, if there was a reasonable belief in the threat, and if a person of reasonable firmness would have done the same thing, then why should he not be allowed to rely on the defense of duress? Okay, so that's the defense of duress, right? First, you must look at the threat, and then we're going to apply the test for duress. And duress is not applicable when a person voluntarily associates himself with criminal organizations that he knew or should have known would have forced him to actually commit the crimes. And duress is also not allowed for the crime of murder. Okay, so just a recap again, the threats must be of death or serious injury. It doesn't have to be directed at defendant. It can be even directed to persons unknown to the defendant, but it must be operating on the mind of the defendant when he committed the offense. And the threat must also include the offense that needs to be committed. The test of duress is that there must be a reasonable belief in the threat, and then would a person of reasonable firmness have done the same thing or not? Now, there is also another type of duress, right? Duress of circumstances. So sometimes they differentiate it by calling it duress of threats and duress of circumstances. Now, duress of circumstances is actually very similar to duress of threats, as we've seen the duress that we've seen just now. But, right, the threat does not have to come from a person, right? It comes from the circumstances. That's why I say duress of circumstances. It can even be a natural occurrence, right? A natural occurrence. So it could be the circumstances or it could be the occurrence. And for duress of circumstances, right, the threat does not have to include the offense that you need to commit. It is not the, as you can see here, do this or else situation. There is no act with the defendant has done in response to the demand of a person applying duress. Rather, he has chosen himself to do an act in reaction to the existence of a circumstance which poses a threat. So sometimes a person in the circumstances may threaten the person's safety, right? And so in order to avoid that, the person may choose to commit a crime, and then he can rely on the defense of duress of circumstances. Let's look at the cases so that you'll be able to understand it better, right? It originated from the case of Villa, which actually applied the case of Conway. And the case of Villa, this was a case where the accused was driving a car, and then he was threatened by a group of young people, right, who were bashing up on his car, beating up the car, and threatening to beat him up also, right? So in order to escape from this group of people, what he did was that he actually drove onto the pavement. He drove onto the pedestrian area there and to get away from the people who were threatening him, right? Because of get away from the circumstances that he was in anyway. Okay. Now he was charged for driving on the pedestrian area there and clearly endangering the lives of the pedestrian. But he basically said that look, that was the only way for me to escape the threat, the circumstances that I was in. Okay, so although the people did not ask those youths did not actually tell him to commit the offense, but because of the circumstances, this was the only way for him to this was the way for him to escape from those circumstances. Okay, so that was Villa, which applied Conway. Conway is something similar. So this was a case where he was chased by someone who was actually a plainclothes policeman. Now, he didn't know he was a policeman, right? So he thought that he was he was in danger, so he ran away from in that circumstances. Now, the requirements for duress of circumstances is provided for in the case of Martin, which is basically the test. And if you look at the test, you will see that it is basically very similar to the test for duress by threats. Okay, the test is that whether the person reasonably believes in the situation, right? He has good cause to fear that otherwise death or serious injury would result. So it's still death or serious injury, and he must have a reasonable belief in the threat. Okay, and whether a person of reasonable firmness, whether a person of reasonable firmness would have done the same thing or not. So whether does he have the reasonable belief in the situation, in the circumstances, and whether a person of reasonable firmness would have done the same thing or not. So we go back to the case of Crown against Cole, right? Because this was the case where he did not, the people who were threatening him, the money lenders, did not ask him to commit the crime, right? They were just threatening him only, asking him to pay back the money. So do you think he can actually rely on duress of circumstances? Well, he actually tried to also, right? He actually tried to also, and it was also not allowed, right? It was also not allowed. This is what Lord Justice Simon Brown said. Considerations of proportionality aside, there was lacking here the situation of imminent peril, which on any view is a necessary precondition to the defense properly arising. So in the first place, it was not proportionate. And secondly, there must be an imminent peril, right? There must be an imminent peril. When we talk about duress of circumstances, the circumstances must be threatening him there and then. There must be an imminent peril. just like in the case of Wheeler, where he was threatened by the group of youths, or in the case of Conway, where he thought that he was threatened by a group by a plainclothes policeman. All right, so there must be an imminent peril, right? The money changers were not there at that point of time, although they threatened to beat him up, they were not there at that point of time. So there's no imminent peril that if he didn't commit the offense, he would suffer the consequences. Now, the extent of this defense is only until the circumstances end, right? When the circumstances cease to exist, then you cannot rely on that anymore, right? You cannot carry on continuing committing the offense if the circumstances no longer exist, right? If the circumstances no longer exist, then you are not allowed to actually carry on committing the offense because there's no more the element of duress. Now we see this in the case of Crown against Palmer. Crown against Palmer was a case where the defendant said that a friend came to him in the middle of the night with a loaded weapon and said that he was going to commit a crime, and he managed to convince the friend to give him the weapon, right? So he persuaded his friend not to commit the crime, and he took the weapon away from him, and he kept the weapon. He kept it with him, right? He kept it with him. He actually kept it under his pillow. Okay? Probably maybe he thought that was the safest place for him to keep the loaded weapon. So he was subsequently found with the loaded weapon the next day and charged for the offense of possessing the loaded weapon, right? And basically, the court said that if you want to rely on the defense of duress or circumstances, you can actually continue to commit the offense as long as the circumstances exist. But once the circumstances stop existing, then you are not allowed to commit the offense anymore, right? You're not allowed to commit the offense anymore once the circumstances cease to exist. So that's basically duress of circumstances, right? Where it's very similar to duress of threats, except that here it is based mainly on the circumstances, right? On circumstances that the defendant was in, and there is no need for there to be he himself chooses what crime to commit, right? He himself chooses what crime to commit, unless unlike the defense of duress by threats, where the crime was nominated by the person making the threats.